Hey everybody, this is Spaz, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of But Is It Synthpop? Now, you normally know me when I host the But Is It Power Pop shows, and I'm trying to sort of take that whole idea and maybe go through some of those 80s bands that we all love so much and sort of differentiate between what is synth pop and what isn't synth pop. So I'm going to go ahead, and I've got a few stacks here. I'm leaving out some pretty major bands in hopes that I continue this series. If not, this is the only one. This is the only episode, maybe. Who knows? But thank you and welcome to But Is It Synth Pop? We're going to start off with what I consider the ultimate synth pop record, and that would be Human League Dare. This thing is precision clean, melodic synth pop produced by Martin Rushent. It is fantastic. The band actually released a few earlier, more minimalistic synth pop records that were more actually experimental. But by the time they hit Dare, they were in full flight, just pop, gorgeous, absolutely wonderful pop. One of the main songwriters on here was Joe Callis, and he was in a band actually just a few years before called the Rezillos, and they were like a Scottish punk pop band. And but he was one of the main songwriters on this album, and he remained with the band for a few years. This is actually what I consider the absolute essential Human League album. I don't know if this box set's still available, so you may just have to buy the regular album, but it's definitely worth adding to your collection. It is definitely, yes, synth pop. Then we're going to cut to something that is still synth pop, but sort of on the opposite end. This is Soft Cell. This is actually the debut album. Soft Cell were definitely a synth pop band, a duo, of course, but their synth pop sound was dirtier. I read it somewhere, probably an Enemy or Trouser Press or something, that sort of compared them to sort of a garage synth pop band. And that actually, compared to Human League, is definitely true, where Human League is just wonderfully produced, every beat in place. Sometimes Soft Cell sounds like it's going to go maybe into sleazy, well, actually it does go into a lot of sleazy areas, but I mean musically, sometimes it feels like it's going to maybe stray into something dirtier or something more experimental. And that's the wonderful thing about Soft Cell, actually the first three records here. And they are definitely synth pop, but like I said, dirtier and darker than Human League, but definitely would please any 80s fan. Now I'm just going to show the first two albums from Tears for Fears. Were Tears for Fears synth pop? No, they are not synth pop. But a lot of tracks on this album are predominantly keyboard oriented, but there's enough guitar and other instruments in there to sort of move them away from synth pop. This definitely is not synth pop. Keyboards are definitely heavy on this record, but they're more for atmosphere and flavor. And but I mean, the songs are great. Roland and Kurt, their vocals are great. You should definitely check them out, but they are not synth pop. Some of you, most of you, I mean, the 80s fans will know that, but sometimes people don't. You know, they look back at 80s music and they just throw it all into new wave, or they throw it all into synth pop. Oh, if that guy's got a funny hairstyle, he's got to be this type of music. Well, it's not always that way. It's not always that simple. Let's go into one of the more famous bands still together today, Depeche Mode. This album right here is definitely 100% synth pop. In fact, a lot of the music seems to be influenced by the same music that influenced power pop artists. You know, 50s, 60s pop, except instead of guitars, this is pretty much keyboards and programs and you know, but they've got the same types of hooks. I'm sure that you can probably take this album, Speak and Spell, their first album, and play it on guitar and it'll sound like a power pop band. Or, you know, some of you may think that's crazy, but actually it would probably work. It's just simplistic, finely produced pop. And by the next album, which this is one of my favorite album covers of all time, by the way, Broken Frame, they started getting darker. And with each subsequent album, they got darker and darker. But basically, up through Violator, solid, great synth pop on the darker edge. Even not sleazy like Soft Cell, but darker, like maybe depressing in some ways, but still absolutely wonderful. Let's show Duran Duran Rio. Is that synth pop? No. Duran Duran is not synth pop. Duran Duran has guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, all sort of vying for space. And of course, Simon Le Bonhead's vocals, or Simon Le Bon. And the first two albums are stellar. Self-titled and Rio are just great albums. After that, they sort of lost the plot. But, again, maybe I shouldn't say stuff like that, because this isn't really critiquing of the bands. Yes, it is. But it's more talking about the style. So save your anger for later. One of my favorites, Flock of Seagulls. Everybody says Flock of Seagulls are synth pop. I say no. Flock of Seagulls are not synth pop. Flock of Seagulls are actually a 4-piece rock band. One of the members happens to play keyboards. And so the keyboards are there, again, vying for space, just like the guitar. Paul Reynolds plays guitar much like The Edge, with a lot of echo and delay and stuff. And basically all the instruments and the vocals and the production, basically they make up the band, or the sound of the band. And, it's certainly, they may rely on keyboards, but keyboards isn't the main part of the band. And, but definitely, these 3 albums here are just absolutely stellar, solid. Out of these 3, I would think that Listen might be the most synth poppy of their albums, but they are not a synth pop band, but keyboards do make up a huge chunk of their sound. And another release to get, this came out on Cherry Red Records. It's a collection of remixes and B-sides and stuff like that. So if you don't have the actual albums, or if you do have the regular CDs and you want to collect a lot of bonus tracks, you can track that down. Let's talk about the Pet Shop Boys. Yes, it's synth pop, but it's also disco, or Italo disco, and electronic disco, and later on house and stuff like that. But in the 80s, it was a mixture of, here's a limited edition box of their hits. It's really synth pop meets disco. So if that doesn't sound like it's your cup of tea, then you may not want to check out anymore. But they, at least the first decade or so is definitely right along the lines of a lot of the other synth pop stuff of the 80s. So I definitely recommend them. Devo. No, not synth pop. Especially not on these 2 albums. This is quirky, artsy, wonderful, avant-garde, experimental rock. By the time they hit Freedom of Choice, which is an absolutely stellar album, they could probably be considered in fact, even this album as well, they could actually be considered synth pop, but they really aren't, because, again, their sound never relied on keyboards before. They just brought keyboards up to the front on these 2 albums. So they can be confused for synth pop, but it's not really. It's more sort of intelligent art rock that just happens to use a lot of keyboards. So, but still, if you're going to get into Devo, you have to at least get these first 4 albums. Definitely worth your time and your money. Let's kick into Buzzcocks. No, Buzzcocks were not synth pop. Buzzcocks were punk pop, or pop punk, whatever you want to call them. But when Pete Shelley released his first 2 solo albums, he was definitely along the lines of synth pop. Not 100% synth pop, but remember how I talked about Martin Rushent producing the Human League album and how precise and wonderful and clean it was? Martin also produced Buzzcocks, and he also produced the first 2 Pete Shelley solo albums. These actually take the sound of Human League, that keyboard sound, but then it still adds guitar. And then Pete Shelley has a quirky way of singing and writing, or he did actually, R.I.P. Pete, or R.I. Pete. But he definitely, these are borderline. It's right in between synth pop and new wave or something, whatever you want to call it. But especially this album is just wonderful. This was a total shocker when it came out, because you didn't expect Pete to go from this guitar-fueled punk to this really clean synth pop sound, but he did, and it works perfectly. A lot of Buzzcocks fans were sort of thrown, taken by surprise. But since I was a fan of punk pop Buzzcocks and I was a fan of Human League, it was perfect for me. Definitely worth investigating that sound, or these two albums, because there are lots of great songs on them. These have bonus tracks on them too, so definitely worth your time. Here is a band right there, Buggles. Is it synth pop? I'd say it's pretty close to it. They do have a lot of other instrumentation on there, but the Buggles actually, after these two albums, two guys joined Yes for an album. And Trevor Horn, the singer, went off and produced a bunch of records, including Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And then, of course, Jeffrey Downs went on to form Asia. And he worked with Asia and John Wetton on and off for 20, 30 years. And now he's a member of Yes again. So, but Buggles is definitely a band that is keyboard-oriented. Second album here is much more experimental. This is the album that has Video Killed the Radio Star. So if you think that's pure synth pop, then you're definitely going to want to check them out. One of the great producers of I guess, the 80s and 90s is a gentleman by the name of Rupert Hine. And Rupert used to be in a band called Quantum Jump, and they had a hit called Lone Ranger in the UK in the 70s. And when he went solo, he produced his own records, wrote his stuff, and he started putting out these very original albums. They're not synth pop. They are electronic oriented, keyboard oriented albums that definitely have that great feel of the 80s. Yeah, maybe they might be dated now in terms of their sound, but he put out these great records. He did the soundtrack to Better Off Dead, if anybody remembers that movie. It's a great 80s movie. And he wrote and produced a lot of the material on there. He does a duet with Cy Curnin from The Fix. And in fact, he produced The Fix. So if you're wondering what Rupert Hine might sound like, imagine a one-man Fix. You know, it has that. It's very wonderfully produced and arranged, but just a lot more minimal than a band like The Fix and stuff. But he also formed a band called Think Man, which is actually the great thing about Think Man is it featured these four members on the back cover, but it was actually just a solo albums under, it's just Rupert Hine solo albums, and they sort of just put these pictures and made it seem like it was a full band. But there's 3 Think Man albums and a bunch of Rupert Hine albums. So if you like the sound of The Fix, you're definitely going to want to get into Rupert Hine. Wildest Wish to Fly may be the most immediate album to get into, but all his solo stuff is fantastic. He also has an album from '94, his last solo album, which was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then finally, speaking of The Fix, let's talk about The Fix. It's right here. Reach the Beach, one of the 80s greatest albums. The Fix are most certainly not power pop, but I'll tell you, Rupert Greenall's keyboard playing definitely flavors the sound. So a lot of times, the keyboards are just in the background, just adding atmosphere, but adding a lot of flavor to the to the full sound. You got Jamie West Orm's guitar, which is dominant on the records, and of course vocalist Cy Kernan, and you got like Dan K. Brown on bass, and you got Adam Woods on drums, and the Fix had. They're not as prolific as they were in the 80s, but they have a lot more albums than you probably imagine. And the last album is right here, and that was actually 2012, and they've promised a new album for a while, but they just take a long time in the studio. They're always touring, and if you go see the Fix, you will see the same 5 guys that played on Reach the Beach, because 4 of those members have been there since the very beginning. The bass player, Dan K. Brown, joined during right after Reach the Beach came out, but he toured the album, and he played with them for like another 10 years or so, and he dropped out for a little while, I believe for health reasons, but he's been back for at least a half a dozen years, so definitely check that out. But that's all I have for you right now. You have watched the first episode of But Is It Synthpop? See, the difference is, but is it power pop? Straight down the line, man. Watch my fingers. Power pop. But synth pop. But is it synth pop? They wiggle. My fingers wiggle. See, now you know the difference. So if you have the sound turned down and you see me do that, you know it's an episode of But Is It Synth Pop? Anyway, thanks for hanging out, and I hope you had a good time. I hope you maybe learned something, or I hope you just want to go on YouTube or actually Amazon and start buying stuff instead of just streaming it, because streaming kind of sucks. You should actually purchase and support your musicians, support your favorite bands, support your favorite artists, or else they're going to end up in a small little room like me surrounded by a bunch of junk. So anyway, that's it. Thank you, and smell you later.